All right, if you want to follow along tonight, we will continue in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy 3 will be where we will read from. We started what was part 1 of verses 1 through 9, and this will be part 2, and we may or may not have a part 3, I'm not sure. But in a moment we'll read these verses again by way of reminder, but I want to sort of set the table again for where it is that we're going and where we've been. So we've been studying the book of 2 Timothy, and it's a book written by Paul to Timothy, and there's a lot of just practical things here for Paul to tell Timothy about being a worker approved, being a good worker for God's kingdom. And in chapter 2, if you recall, he shows Timothy a lot of things to do, such as in verse 15, to be a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But he also showed him a lot of things to not do, to not be quarrelsome, and things along those lines, to cleanse yourself from what is dishonorable on through that chapter. And we get to chapter 3 and we wonder, well, why does all of these things matter? Well, they matter because of what we read in verse 1. He says, understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. And so the reason why these things matter, why Paul is telling these things to Timothy, is because there's a time of difficulty that was coming, if it wasn't already there. And Timothy needed to be prepared. He needed to be equipped for how to handle this circumstance. And so, there's difficult times coming, and that takes us again to chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. So what we'll do, I'll read this again. I'll read the whole section, and then we'll review a little bit of where we went last week. We covered the first 3 verses, but we'll just read this section again just to sort of refresh our memory. So this again is 2 Timothy chapter 3, starting in verse 1. He says, but understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. But they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those 2 men. So what we see in this section, and I think we did a good job highlighting this last week, is he says in verse 1, there will be a time of difficulty. And in verse 2, we see that the difficult times are caused by difficult people. And it's interesting, he says there will come times of difficulty, and then the very next thought is for people will be, and then he goes through this list. And so we see that it's the people that make things difficult. And we know this to be true in other facets of life, not just pertaining to spiritual things. If you've ever worked a retail job, you probably know that people are difficult to deal with. If you've ever been in a place of business and maybe an employee is giving you a hard time, or maybe you see someone else giving another worker a hard time. We, as people, tend to sometimes not be in the best mood, and we can sometimes take it out on people. And so we know that difficult people can lead to difficult times, but what Paul has in mind here is especially difficult people spiritually speaking. These are people who aren't just having a bad day like what you might see in a grocery store or in a restaurant. These are people who have these qualities that he lists. So he gives this lengthy list of vices, of bad behaviors. and these describe these people who will make Timothy's service difficult. And again, there are 19 different things here that he lists. This is among, if not the lengthiest list of sins in the entire Bible. Paul has a tendency to put things in big lists. This is among the longest, at least in terms of the count of items. And one thing to notice is these qualities, they are real and they are evident in our society today. These are things that you can clearly see in other people. These are patterns that you notice. You read through this list, and we could probably think of some people that we've come across who fit some of these descriptions in one way or another. And so, one thing to point out, the fact that these qualities are evident, that they can be clearly seen, it shows that we are in the last days. In verse 1 he says that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. And people tend to take that and make it apply to something that's in the very distant future. Truth be told, it's now. We're living through the last days as we speak. And there's nothing that comes after this. After Jesus comes back, there's nothing else that's going to happen. That's what we're waiting on is the Lord's return. And so we are in the last days. And so in verse 1, when he says that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, this is how we know it, because there are these people. And if we're honest with ourselves, maybe sometimes we fit that description. So we need to be careful about that, especially if we're among non-believers. And so we looked at a few of these items in the list last week. We got through verses 2 and 3. And so he begins by saying they are lovers of self, lovers of money, proud or boasters. They're arrogant. They are abusive or blasphemers. They speak bad things against other people. They are disobedient to their parents. They are ungrateful or unthankful. They are unholy. They are heartless or unloving. They are unappeasable, unforgiving. They are slanderous or malicious gossips, as some versions put it. They are without self-control. They are brutal. And then they are not loving good, or they are hating good. And so that catches us up to the ground that we covered last week. Are there any comments or questions on any of that before we go on to verse 4? Yeah. It's been a long time, probably as long as a lot of us can remember, right? So in verse 4, we see the list continue. And he says that they are treacherous. Some versions might use the word traitors. It's interesting when you think about someone who is a traitor. We probably think of, in the Bible, we probably think of Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus. And this is the word that is used of Judas, who of course did betray Jesus. If you look in Luke chapter 6 and verse 16, Luke gives some commentary as to who Judas is when he's listing out the 12. And so he says, he's listing the 12 apostles, and in verse 16 he says, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. It's the same word that Paul uses here, that Luke uses to describe Judas Iscariot. So this is one who betrays Jesus, who betrays our Lord. And so there are people, and we probably know people, we've maybe even been victims of this, who just go around betraying people left and right. They have no loyalty to anyone except themselves. And this again fits what we saw in verse 2 of being a lover of self. People who love themselves and not anyone else, they will betray anyone in order to get their way. You think of when Judas betrayed Jesus. What did he get out of that? Just some silver coins. Really not that much. And yet he was willing to do that because he saw how that advanced his way of life even farther. Of course, he has great regret of that later on, and we most of us, I think, know what happens to Judas, but there are a lot of people that fit this description. People that are treacherous, people that are traitors, people that you don't trust. He also talks about those who are reckless or headstrong, people who are rash. I like this image because the word that's used here literally means to fall forward. These are people who, it's almost like a toddler whose head is too big for the rest of their body and they just keep falling forward like that. That's sort of the idea behind these people. And the idea is they rush into things without giving any thought or any concern. They don't care about the repercussions. They don't care about the consequences. All they care about is just doing what it is that they want to do, whatever that thing might be. They are reckless, compulsive, you could even say. I'm sure we know people like this, and we even can be like this at times. If you're too reckless, it's very detrimental to us. He also talks about those who are swollen with conceit. So other versions use the word haughty. I like the image of someone who's swollen with conceit. It pictures someone who just has this exaggerated opinion about themselves and about their qualities. You hear the expression, they're too big for their britches. That's kind of the idea behind this. Someone who is just so full of themselves, they really think that they're much better. And again, lover of self. Really, all of these can go back to someone who is a lover of themselves or a lover of money, like we see in verse 2. We see that they're lovers of something else, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, pleasure seems like a desirable thing. There's a reason why pleasures are tempting to us, right? But what we fail to realize is that a lot of times these pleasures have consequences. A lot of times these pleasures have an adverse reaction in our life. You could think about the example of sex. Sex seems like a pleasurable thing, and in the right context, it's a good thing. But in the wrong context, what happens? You have things like unplanned pregnancies. You have the spreading of diseases. You have things along those lines. And so we see in this that you can love pleasure, but pleasure may not always love you back. And again, this love of pleasure, it stems from their love of self. And what it boils down to is they would rather gratify their fleshly desire than submit to and please God. And all of us at times, when we give in to these temptations, we fall into this line of thinking as well. Sometimes we love pleasure more than we love pleasing the Lord. And we need to be careful of that. Anything on verse 4 before we go to verse 5? Garfield?
I can't remember where it's at in the Bible, but I remember reading that verse one time as pleasure in sin. Mm-hmm. And this really applies here. I don't know where, but I know it's in there, but I just can't think where it's at. So there's pleasure in sin.
Yeah, a lot of the sin, it's things that we might think that we enjoy doing. We don't realize the repercussions of that. And of course, the biggest repercussion of these things is it separates us from God. That alone is consequence enough. But when you get the other things added onto it, that makes it, of course, so much worse. In verse 5, we see that they have the appearance of godliness, but they deny its power. This might almost seem like a paradox. You look through this list and you see, okay, they're a lover of self, they're a lover of money, they're proud, they're arrogant, they're abusive, they're disobedient to their parents. You go on down the list and you think, oh yeah, this is, scum of the earth type behavior. But then you get to verse 5 and they have the appearance of godliness. And it makes you wonder, you see these traits, and these are traits that we can see in other people, yet they can have the appearance of godliness. This shows us that despite all of these previous characteristics, someone can still appear godly. Now, to inform people, we might know better. We can see through that appearance, but maybe there are some times when we can't see that. Sometimes maybe the trait is inwardly kept, it's secretive, and we could be none the wiser. And so it's interesting to think about someone who could have these characteristics. They can still appear godly, and they can fool some people. And a lot of times this is why, if they come and they're teaching a false doctrine, this is one of the reasons why they can be so persuasive. Is they might look godly. They might have the appearance of being a godly person. But in reality, like Jesus says, they are wolves in sheep's clothing. And so we need to be careful of this. Someone who has the outward appearance, we need to examine their fruit to better determine, is this someone who is living a life in the Spirit, pleasing the Lord? Or is this someone who is, again, a lover of self and a lover of money and on down the list? But I also think this should make us think. Are we appearing godly and nothing more? Or are we really godly? We need to not only examine other people, but we need to first, I would say, examine ourselves. We might sometimes trick ourselves into thinking we're godly because we appear to be godly. You think of things like going to church services, being here for worship. That has the appearance of being godly, but I think we can all realize being here is not enough to simply say that you're godly. We might look around and we might fool people by singing praises. Again, that's an outward appearance. But do we really mean the things that we're singing? Are we thinking about the things that we're singing? Or are we more focused on carrying a tune? That's something we need to be leery of. You could look around and someone could even be partaking in the Lord's Supper. They could have their head down. They might have the appearance of being godly, but again, appearance versus reality, two different things. You could even put money in the collection basket. It's a plate in the picture, but we have baskets here. And so again, we might even fool ourselves. We think, oh, well, I go to church, which first of all, church isn't something you go to, it's who you are, right? I sing on Sunday mornings. Not everyone sings, but I sing. I take the Lord's Supper. I put my head down when I do it. I even contribute. Well, again, these things have the appearance of godliness, and these are certainly signs in the right direction, but these things in and of themselves are not enough. If you have the appearance of godliness in this building, but we see you outside this building and that appearance is gone, and we see the fruit for what it is, that's a dangerous thing. We need to be leery of that, not just in other people, but ourselves. So he talks about how they have the appearance of godliness, but they deny its power. What does it look like to deny the power of godliness? What does that look like? I think in this context, given the long list that Paul has laid out for Timothy, in this context, they are denying it, certainly by their behavior. And this reminds me of in Titus chapter 1, when Paul writes to Titus, and he speaks in saying they profess to know God, but they deny Him by their works. Here again, you have the idea, outward appearance of godliness, but a denial by the things that they are doing. And of course, you could think of what Jesus says to the Pharisees when he quotes from Isaiah saying, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Again, you have the appearance, but you also have that inward reality. Jesus goes on to say about them that they are nothing more than whitewashed tombs. The outside looks nice and well kept, but on the inside, what is it? It's a tomb. There's death in there. And so we need to be careful about that for ourselves, and we need to think of that when it comes to these people as well. And so they are denying godliness, the power of godliness, by their behavior. And so by not living in accord with godliness and not living a godly life, and that is a life that is in the image and the likeness of Jesus, keeping with His standards, keeping with His will, rightly dividing the word of truth, not going to the left or the right, but keeping on that path, by not living that way, they are not allowing godliness to transform their lives and grow their faith. They're not putting themselves in a position for godliness to have its effect. And so in turn, they are denying its power entirely by their actions. So I touched on it earlier, and I'll touch on it again. When you read and you examine this list, it's obvious that these things exist today. We know people that are lovers of self and lovers of money. We know people that are ungrateful, that are unholy, that are treacherous, that are reckless, swollen with conceit. We know people like this. And so, because we can see these things in our world today, this again further shows that the last days is now. We're living through it as we speak. So we are in this time of difficulty that Paul talked about. Garfield?
Along with this, only was back in Proverbs. Solomon wrote in Proverbs, the 6th chapter. He talked about the 6 sins that God hates. I'll start out in verse 16. These 6 things does the Lord hate, yet 7 are abomination unto him. 1, he says, a proud look, a lying tongue, and a hand that sheds innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imagination, feet that are swift and run into mischief, false witness that speaketh lies. He that soweth discord among his brethren, and sometimes this could fit us. My son, keep thy father's commandments, and forsake not the law of thy mother. So these sins carried on a long time ago.
Yeah, what does Solomon say in Ecclesiastes? There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
These are things that people have been doing really as long as time has existed itself. And so, again, the times are difficult because the people make for these difficult times. And it's interesting, you look at... Were you going to say something, CJ?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say you talk about fake people. When Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:14, no wonder for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And so, like Jesus said, if we're living this double life world, our father the devil does it.
Yes, so CJ points out, if you didn't hear him, that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians that the devil disguises himself as an angel of light. And so the devil is one who puts on this outward appearance. And so when other people are doing that, like Jesus said, you're of your father, the devil. And so we really need to be careful of that in our own life. And we need to be careful as well when we come across people like this because of what Paul says next. So after he lists all these sinful behaviors, he has one command for Timothy. And it's interesting, you think of all these things, he gives him one thing to do. Avoid such people. That's what he says to do. Avoid such people. Don't let these people in your circle. Avoid these people. We know Paul says in another place that bad company corrupts good morals. So if you want to keep your good morals, keep the bad company out. And so he tells Timothy here, avoid such people. And these are people, we could probably think of people we know. They're probably people we don't want to be around anyway, right? So he tells them, avoid such people. And this fits with what we've already seen at this point in this book. And so in order for Timothy to not get entangled with worldly or civilian pursuits, as he says in verse 4 of chapter 2, in order for Timothy to depart from iniquity, to cleanse himself of what is dishonorable, to flee youthful passions, he needs to avoid people such as this. And so Paul has given him these things to do and then these things to avoid. And the way he needs to do that is by avoiding these people, because these people will get him if he lets them into this behavior. So he tells him, you need to avoid such people. And so again, we ask the question, why does this matter? Well, it matters because this doesn't just apply to Timothy. It applies to us. This applies to the church. The church, we as Christians, we need to be aware of these things, and we need to know to look for these things. It matters because this will have an effect on the church. And we see this in what else Paul says in the rest of this section. One of the things about difficult people, they don't keep their vices to themselves. In verse 6, He says, "For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women." And so they don't just keep these things among themselves, but they try to take it and spread it. They say sharing is caring. In this case, it's not caring. In this case, it's trying to lead to these people's destruction. And it's interesting, he says, among them are those who creep into households. Other versions say worm. And so you kind of get the idea of what kind of person this is. Someone who creeps, someone who is kind of slithering around like a worm. The literal word here means to enter into an area through devious means or pretense. So what this is entailing is someone who is specifically going to a place with bad intentions in mind. This is predatory. And so even among these things that Paul has listed, one other thing that we know about these people is they are predatory. They, again, following after the devil, they are looking for people to devour and to bring into whatever it is that they are doing. He says that once they are in these households, they capture weak women. Some versions might use the word gullible here. Now, notice that Paul is not saying that all women are weak. Some people might claim that. That's not what he's saying. It's interesting. The word capture here, this is a military term. And it's typically used in reference to prisoners of war. You capture someone and you hold them as a prisoner. And so in this context, as Paul is using it, it's referring to, firstly, misleading and then deceiving these women in order to control them, in order to bring them into whatever mistruths it is that they are a part of. I don't know why that didn't work. And so this is what they're trying to do. They are on enemy lines trying to bring people in as prisoners. This is the idea with what Paul is communicating to Timothy. And notice, so he calls them weak women or gullible women, and he actually goes on, Paul does, to describe what it is that makes these women weak or gullible. He does this in verses 6 and 7. Don't do it, CJ. First, he says they are burdened with sins. We, at one time or another, know what this has felt like, to be burdened with sin, the feeling of shame, the feeling of guilt. And these feelings, it can cloud our thinking, and it can do so quite easily. We get overtaken by these feelings, and it can make us do things that maybe we otherwise wouldn't do, but because our way of thinking is clouded, all of a sudden we might be more susceptible to something that we otherwise wouldn't be. He also says that they are led astray by various passions or various lusts. The idea behind this is that they are lacking in self-control. They're easily persuaded one way or another. And you see this in the next point that he makes about these women as well, in that they are always learning, but they're never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. I think we know people like this, don't we? And what happens with these people is they begin to believe these other things that have no basis in reality at all, but yet they still believe it. On the one hand, you could see this is maybe saying something good about these women. They seem to have a desire to learn, and that's a good thing. But when you're lacking discernment, when, like he says before, they are easily led astray, this can be a recipe for disaster. So if you have a desire to learn, but you're lacking discernment, then really you could be led astray by anything. And many people today pursue learning without pursuing truth. You can see this in our academic institutions, probably most notably. People get all these degrees, yet you ask them simple questions and they can't explain things. They're ill-equipped to deal with the real world. They learn a lot, but none of it is the truth. None of it pertains to things that really matter. Reminds me of what Paul writes in Romans 1. He says, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Now listen to this. So they're futile in their thinking. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And that chapter goes on, and he talks about the behavior that they get engulfed in. And so you have people, they want to learn. In some cases, that's a good thing. Sometimes you come across someone and they're like a sponge and they just soak up as much as they can. And when you're coming across someone and you want to teach them the truth, that's a good thing. But it's a bad thing when someone gets to them first and they teach them these falsehoods. And so people like this, they are ripe soil for deception. And so it's interesting, you look at what Paul is saying here. These people that are going after these women, they're predatory. They're looking for weak people to take advantage of. In our culture, we frown upon that. We call those people all sorts of names, right? This is the kind of people that Paul is talking about. And so you see not just the things they do, but you see just who they are. And these are people we certainly should want to avoid. Any comments on that before we get to verses 8 and 9? CJ?
Always warning and never telling someone made me think of Acts 17:21. Now all the Athenians and strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling and hearing something new. So this is what the Athenians were doing in Acts 17. They were worried about the stuff, but they never came to any conclusion about it.
Yes, so CJ, if you didn't hear me, quotes what is said in Acts 17 and verse 21, where it says, now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. The idea of just wanting to learn the next new thing, trying to come to this, I guess, state of enlightenment. And you see this a lot with Eastern religions, and maybe that's part of what the Athenians were influenced by. And he says, when Paul says they're always learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth, this describes the Athenian people when Paul was there. And it describes a lot of people that we could probably think of. Again, you think of the people, they've got all the academic degrees. They have associates, a bachelor's, a master's, doctorates, PhDs even. And yet, some of these people are the dumbest people that you come across. And it really makes you wonder, well, what is it that you're paying all that money to learn? It's a waste of money and it's a waste of time in a lot of cases. That's not to say that there's no value in higher education, but a lot of these people, they are learning and not coming to a knowledge of the truth. Anything else, Jim?
Academia, it's a lot of people, especially with the information age that we're in, it's so easy to look up things. And if you're trying to teach somebody the truth right from the Bible, sometimes it's difficult because they can always find some other argument or some crazy doctrine online or from somebody else, and they pick up these things and it just kind of blurs their understanding of truth and true knowledge. And I think of this passage in Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, starting in verse 1, it says, Paul writes, my heart's desire and prayer for God, to God for Israel, is that they would be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. And so I think that there's a lot of, it's very easy for people to have a zeal for God and fear godly, but never being ignorant of truth.
Yeah, Jim raises a really good point. He quoted from Romans 10 where Paul says that he's speaking of Israel. He says they have a zeal for God, but it's not based on knowledge. And that probably describes a lot of people who think that they're Christians. They have this zeal for God, but it's not based on knowledge. And there's so many different resources out there, and almost none of them really are truthful. They might have hints of truth to them, and that's what makes them so persuasive oftentimes, but then they go down this other direction that doesn't accord with rightly handling the word of truth. And it's so easy to be persuaded by these things. You could find a random preacher on YouTube, televangelists on TV that lead you on all kinds of wild goose hunts. Things along those lines, yet alone people that peddle other religions or peddle other things. And so, yeah, people might have a zeal for these things, but if it's not based on knowledge, then they're not going to come to a knowledge of the truth. Garfield?
A lot of people today go on their feelings, how they feel, instead of going by God's word, what God tells us to do.
Yeah, a lot of people, they base their view on a certain thing on just how it makes them feel. Not on what God's word says, but on whatever it is that they want. I've actually been studying a topic this week where there's a lot of that, where people say, well, I know the Bible says this, but I don't like that, and so I believe this other thing instead. And you could fill in the blank. There's a lot of areas of doctrine that you could make that people do that with. They say, well, I don't like that, so I'm going to do it this way. People do that more than they should, certainly. All right, so we come to verses 8 and 9, and Paul mentions these people, Jannes and Jambres. And you may not know who these people are. And if you don't know who they are, that's fine, because they're not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, at least to my knowledge, besides here, at least not by name. He likens these predators to Jannes and Jambres. In my Bible, it's not the Bible, I didn't write it, but it's my copy of the Bible. I feel like I have to say that sometimes when I say in my Bible it has this, like, oh, did you make that yourself? No. But here there's a footnote or it's a cross-reference actually, with Jannes and Jambres, and it points to Exodus chapter 7. And the reason for this is because there was some Jewish tradition that names these two people, Jannes and Jambres, as the magicians, at least to some of the magicians, who opposed Moses in Exodus 7. And so if you remember in Exodus 7, I'll have that text on the screen here in a second. In Exodus 7, Moses and Aaron are going to Pharaoh to try to persuade Pharaoh to let the people go out of Egypt, and they begin to do these signs with Moses' staff. And there are men there, other magicians or sorcerers, who duplicate, it seems, these signs that Moses and Aaron are doing. And so these are the magicians who tried to duplicate and undermine the miracles performed by Moses. And you can see what's happening. Moses comes, he performs a miracle. Well, then these Egyptians come and they perform a miracle. We don't know how they do it, but they seem to do it, as if to say, well, if you can do it, we can do it too. You're not all that special. And so in Exodus 7, in this particular instance, starting in verse 10, it says, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. They're going to go and they're going to do these signs to Pharaoh. It says, Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. And then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. And so it's these wise men and sorcerers, these magicians, these are the people that Paul is mentioning here. And so when he quotes this tradition, he's giving some credibility that these are the men. Now, I don't know if this is their actual names, but these are the people that Paul is talking about when he makes this reference. And so they come and they oppose Moses and Aaron. And what Paul is saying is these people who fit the bill of these various sins and vices listed in verses 2 through 5, these people are doing the same thing that Jannes and Jambres did to Moses. He likens these predators to these people. And this is the picture that Paul is painting. Just thinking big picture here. This is what he's communicating. These predators, they are in opposition to the truth. Remember what he said in chapter 2 when he speaks of Hymenaeus and Philetus. He says in verse 18 of that chapter that they have swerved from the truth. Well, here, these people are in opposition to the truth. Just like the Egyptian sorcerers were, what they peddle, it might have the appearance of the truth. They say every good lie has a hint of truth to it, and I think that's true when it comes to false doctrine. It might sound good. Some doctrine you hear, and you could just tell right away, this is, for lack of a better word, this is stupid. But some you hear and you think, well, I could kind of see where they're coming from with that, but if you look closely with the Scriptures, it doesn't add up. But just like what the Egyptians were doing, they might have the appearance of truth and they have the appearance of godliness, but in reality, it's actually competing with the truth. They are in opposition to each other. And what Paul goes on to say is in verse 9, or in verse 8, he says that they are corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. What it is that disqualifies them is the fact that they are in opposition to the truth. This is more than just a feeling. You have to actually have facts. You have to have truth. And just like the Egyptian sorcerers, in verse 9, he says, they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men. The reason you could tell, back to the story in Exodus 7, why those other sorcerers were wrong is because Aaron's staffs swallowed up their staffs. They were able to duplicate the miracle, but at the end of the day, one of their staff serpent things swallowed up the other ones. So that's how you know who won. And so just as it was for them, for these people, these predators, when you examine their fruit, you'll tell that they are also on the wrong side, and you'll also be able to decipher who they are and who they're working for. And so we've been looking at this contrast, and you see a lot of it in chapter 2, but it carries over here into chapter 3 as well. You have, on the one hand, a worker who is approved. This is what we as Christians should strive to be. We want to be a worker approved by God. This shows that, first of all, that we're workers, right? We're doing something for the kingdom. We're contributing something, whatever that might be. And we see the traits of those that are approved by God. They share in suffering, as he's told Timothy twice in this letter, chapter 1 and verse 8, and in chapter 2 and verse 3. They share in suffering. They rightly divide, or they rightly handle the word of truth. They are a vessel for honorable use. They, as the Lord's servant, are not quarrelsome, but they correct opponents with gentleness. And we see that they avoid these difficult people. Now, when these difficult people come in and maybe they're peddling a false doctrine, that doesn't mean that you don't confront them. But that means after you correct them, you avoid them. You don't let them have any influence on you at all. So that is the one side of this equation, a worker who is approved by God. Then you have the opposition. We see in chapter 2 that they have swerved from the truth. We see that they are a vessel for dishonorable use. You go through this list of things, each of those vices could fit this list, but then we see what they try to do. They're predatory. They try to lead other people astray. And as Paul goes on to say, they are corrupted in their mind, and they are disqualified regarding the faith because they are in opposition to the truth itself. And it's important to realize that there is such a thing as truth. Our society today tries to say, well, truth is subjective. It's a matter of your opinion. It's a matter of my opinion. The easiest way that you can combat that is to ask them the question, well, is that true? If they say, well, there's no such thing as truth, is that true? It's a self-defeating claim. It has no basis in reality at all. There is an objective truth. There is objective reality. We know that to be true because we can observe it, because common sense, I think, tells us that. And when people say there's no such thing as truth, that's just their way of getting around how they ought to be living their life, in whatever context that might be. And so Paul has been making this contrast. And the contrast is going to continue when we get to verse 10 next week, Lord willing, when he begins to say to Timothy, you, however. So in verses 1 through 9, he's went on through this long list. He's talked about these people, these predators. He says to avoid these people. He describes what they're doing. And next week, we'll see some more things for Timothy to do. That's the class for tonight. I got through all my material. Isn't that great? Any comments or questions? Lance.
3, we went through this list of bad qualities and people to avoid, but 1 Corinthians chapter 6, it lists titles of bad people like revilers, greedy, swindlers. Speaking to the audience, and such were some as you. So these people in 2 Timothy chapter 3, did they cross the line? Are they past saving?
If your question is if they're past saving, I'd say no. But these are people that are in opposition to the truth, and so if you try to lead them to the truth, they're going to deny it. So that's a situation where you don't want to give a pearl to swine. You need to just let it be and hope that time will maybe correct that. I think that's kind of what you're asking. I'm not totally sure, but I'd say yes if they're causing trouble. If they're predatory people, then yeah, I'd say to avoid them. Jim?
There are people who are doing wrong, but when they learn the truth, they don't oppose the truth anymore and they repent. Then there's people who are doing wrong, even though they know the truth, they continue to oppose the truth. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, so the list you mentioned in 1 Corinthians 6, that's the qualities that the Corinthian Christians used to have, but the key word there is, and such were some of you, but you've been washed, you've been sanctified, you've been justified. And so, and this is what Jim is saying, what it boils down to is how do you respond to the truth? Do you accept it? Do you let it change you? Do you let godliness have its effect? Or do you deny godliness by continuing to do these things even after you know better? These are people that Paul lists here that know better, and yet they are willfully going aside anyway.
You don't return to the old life.
Yeah, if you've died to yourself, then that person is long gone. Anything else?
Corinthians used to do that. The ones in Timothy are doing that. Especially if somebody's gossiping and slandering you and things like that. You have to stay away from it. And some of these people will do it in such a way that they have a image of godliness. I'm doing this for your own good. I'm telling you this for your own good that this person's been doing that. So you got to watch out for him. When he wasn't doing it. And so now he's ruined you. You got to stay away from these people.
Yes, so Steve brings up a good point. First, to Lance's question, there's a difference between they were doing it but have stopped versus people that are continuing to do it. That's what Paul is describing here in 2 Timothy 3. And then you look on through the list, and people that are slanderers, people that are gossips, it's just a recipe for disaster. And they can change your mind, not just on doctrine, but on how you view other people. They can tell you wrong information about someone. That's part of why gossip is so dangerous, is because even if people don't mean to do it, maybe they're just going on hearsay. Hearsay isn't the whole story, right? Yet alone if you're making stuff up and you're purposely trying to belittle people and drag people through the mud, as is the case with what he says here. So there's so much on the line with this. It's no wonder that Paul says avoid such people, because these people, destruction follows them wherever they go. Well, if nothing else, thank you all for your attention tonight, those who did pay attention. We'll be dismissed here in just a moment, but before we do that, Jim will come and he'll share some announcements with us. So thank you again tonight.